Good afternoon, everyone. We will call the Development and Service Committee meeting to order for May the 22nd. Ms. Carrillo, if you will call the roll.
Pugh,
Here.
Teratio, Barron,
Here.
English,
Present.
Newton, and Brenham.
I'm here. This is Shakise.
Okay, and so just for the record, Mr. Brenham is not a part of this committee,
But he's attending the meeting.
but he is attending. And then also, Ms. Newton is virtual. I'm sitting in her stead today and chairing the meeting. She may join us by the end of the meeting, but if not, we will proceed accordingly. With that, the next order of business.
Miss Barron,
Yes, ma'am.
this is Shakise Newton. I'm sorry, you didn't hear me when I said I was here. So I'm going to be muting myself because I'm driving, but I am present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so our next order of business is the approval of minutes from April 25th, 2003. Those are found on pages 6 through 10. Do we have any modifications that need to take place to our minutes? If not, I'll entertain a motion. Move to approve.
Second.
Ms. Carrillo?
Pugh,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes?
English,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Our next order of business is the adoption of the agenda. Mr. Brown, do we have any changes or deletions at this time?
No requested changes.
With that, I'll entertain a motion to accept the agenda as printed.
So move, Madam Chair.
Second. Ms. Carrillo?
Pugh,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes?
English,
Yes.
Newton. Motion
And-
approved.
Thank you. Our next order of business is item 4A. And with item 4A, I'm hitting all the wrong buttons over here today. Apologize for. 4A is Department of Public Works Engineering Division, Carolina Crossroads, Center Point Road right-of-way. Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Chair Barron. We are looking to have the committee approve staff's request. This request comes from the Carolina Crossroads project. If you happen to be looking at this in the packet, I believe it's on page 11. And the recommendation says, Public Works is requesting that the county council transfer the right-of-way as detailed in the attachment on Center Point Road to the South Carolina Department of Transportation for the Carolina Crossroads project. This does not in any way harm Richland County or anything that the county needs for this right-of-way. But this is a part of a larger project, and so we were simply asking that this committee and ultimately council grant this request so that the Carolina Crossroads project may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Are there any questions from the committee? Or I also would like to recognize our colleague, Mr. Weaver, who is also here with us for administration on this item. If not, I'll entertain a motion.
So move, Madam Chair.
Second. Ms. Carrillo?
Pugh,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes?
English,
Yes.
Newton. Motion approved.
Our next order of business is for items for action, 4B, and that is Department of Public Works, Engineering Division, Lake Dogwood Circle South right-of-way. Mr. Brown?
Thank you. The county has an ordinance that allows for unused right-of-way to be provided to adjacent property owners. There's a request process for that. This specific request, as you see there in the packet, I believe on page 17, is related to Lake Dogwood Circle South, whether you have adjoining property owners Bobby J. and Nancy Y. Spivey. If you take a look further down in strategic and general discussion, you will see in that second paragraph, it says this is unused right-of-way in this section of Lake Dogwood Circle South and contains no road or other infrastructure. The requester owns the properties on both sides of the right-of-way in question. The unused right-of-way gives you the details of there listed there. But ultimately, the staff's recommendation is to provide this as recommended in the packet. And again, it does not hinder any work of the county.
Per the recommendation of administration, is there any questions for administration at this time? I'll entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Mr. Grillo?
Pugh,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes?
English,
Yes.
Newton. Motion approved.
Next item on our agenda are items for preliminary action. 5A is short-term rentals. And 5A1, direct the administrator to create regulations for operation of short-term rentals, STRs, in unincorporated Richland County. Those regulations would be listed as an amendment to the current ordinance relating to the residential rental property regulations, similar to the absentee landlord ordinance that is currently being considered. Consideration should be given to license, safety measures, number of occupants allowed, effects on infrastructure such as sewer and water, EMS, law enforcement, potential response, and not creating a nuisance in the neighborhood. This was brought forth by former Councilman Malinowski. Mr. Brown, would you or your staff like to speak on this item to give us an update?
We do have additional team members on my staff who are here. You may recall hearing before from Mr. Zach Kavanaugh with our Business Services Center. And so I'm going to ask him to approach the podium and give a brief update to where the staff is at this point related to this item.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Madam Chair, good afternoon. How about that? Thank you, Mr. Brown. Madam Chair, good afternoon. Zach Kavanaugh, Business Service Center.
Afternoon.
So what we have in front of the body today are two examples of some existing short-term rental ordinances. We have the newly adopted City of Columbia's ordinance, and then we have the Island of Hilton Head's ordinance, which was adopted at least a decade ago. I'm not sure on the exact date. And so we have a team ready to draft the county's ordinance. We would just like some direction from the body on maybe which way to go. So the two ordinances in the packet, they're very different from each other in a bunch of ways. So myself and a member of the legal department and Mr. Jensen sat down and we started picking some of these apart. And we got to a point where we basically kind of needed some direction from the body to see potentially what the body would want in the county's ordinance and how to kind of address some of these things.
Okay. So with that, we'll open up for discussion at this time on the ordinances as presented to us. They are found on pages 24 and 25. And just to remind the body that we did have lengthy conversation in our last meeting discussing exactly what Mr. Kavanaugh has brought to us as far as the comparison of Hilton Head and I just went blank with the other one.
City of Columbia.
City of Columbia, and of which, if I remind me, those two are the two that really rise to the top as recommendations for us to mirror to some degree.
Yes, ma'am.
So with that, discussion on those items. You recognize Ms. English?
I guess mine would just the legality of this when I'm looking at number of occupants allowed. I thought that would be determined by fire and those regular.
Yes, ma'am, Miss English. So in both ordinances, there are caps on occupants. Some of them, I believe the City of Columbia has 2 per bedroom plus an additional 2. So I guess if you had a futon, somebody could sleep on that, or 2 people. And then the Hilton Head Islands also has a similar cap on something like that. But you are correct. Typically the fire marshal's office would designate an occupancy load based on square footage. But since this is residential, I think the ordinance that we draft and adopt initially, or by the end of all this, could have a cap in there for occupancy. Because we want to keep in mind cars, and essentially, I've been getting some input from two groups. It seems like I'm getting some input from neighbors, and then input from people who operate some of these things. And they obviously have different concerns. So we want to kind of make something that has a good balance to try to keep as many folks happy as we can.
Any further discussion? And so while my colleagues, you guys are perusing the paperwork, I think that what's most important is we had a conversation about making sure we definitely want to be in line with our neighbors, which is City of Columbia, because we don't want it to be so drastic when you have a property that's in unincorporated Richland County and they also own property in the City of Columbia, and now we are they're like so drastic from the two, and we have some of those things already in place in the city and in the county where we are like night and day. But I think when we look at, I know for me, when we look at putting forth an ordinance, I would want to see something that makes ease for the property owners while at the same time holding accountability. I personally am a fan of both of the ones that you presented. I think that Hilton Head is in a whole different sphere all by itself when it comes to rental because it is a destination location. I think Richland County is well on our way to being a destination location. That's my hope and my prayer. So as we move forward towards that, I think that we may want to reconsider or consider some of the items from Hilton Head, but to not keep going on in the conversation here, what I would like to see from this committee is that we take a closer look and we also open this up to the other council members to make any suggestions and recommendations. And if we could get that to the clerk's office within 2 weeks, is that doable? And that would mean 2 weeks would be the 6th. And so if we could, the clerk's office, if you would just send out an email to all council members asking them to take a look at these 2 ordinances and provide any feedback and suggestions. And then that would allow us enough time to gather this information and also get it to Mr. Kavanaugh and his team to come back before this body by the end of the month in June. Mr. Pugh, you recognize, yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I definitely agree with Madam Chair. We pose a unique situation here in Columbia. We sort of consider it as a transient town. When we got military, we have a lot of schools of higher education here where kids are in and out, and people purchase property here, and they no longer live here. So I would love to see us tailor this to our community and not penalize those that own property here that no longer live in our community. I think one of the biggest reasons why this came about is because people were getting tired of people not taking care of their property and checking on their property. And so holding people accountable for making sure that they take care of their property is one thing, but we also want to make it palatable for everybody else in our community too. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Pugh.
Madam Chair.
And I see your hand, Ms. Newton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Two things. First, I agree with your suggestion to request feedback from council members and have that come back. But I guess I just wanted to clarify a perception is what I read in the staff briefing seemed like staff wasn't going to cut from whole cloth either Hilton Head or Columbia, but rather that they just wanted to use it for inspiration and that they liked the, for lack of a better term, the crispness of the Hilton Head ordinance as an example. So I wanted to clarify that. But secondly, because I'm going to mute myself again, I would ask if possible, because I am driving and it's hard for me to mute and unmute myself. I have voted in all of the previous votes to, approve the minutes, et cetera, et cetera. But if the clerk could maybe use her Zoom controls to unmute me when it's time to vote so that I can be sure to vote without fiddling with controls. So I had a question and a request.
And the clerk is looking and she's shaking her head as she navigates this, the chambers. She's going to do her very best to mute and unmute you at the time of our voting, because we definitely want you to be safe. So with that, Mr. Kavanaugh, do you have a comment to what Ms. Newton said?
Yes, certainly, Ms. Newton. So you're exactly right. So when we were looking at these two ordinances, there's some things in both that would work for Richland County. There's some things that would probably need to be omitted, and there's some things that would need to be kind of matched together, right? So I think our draft ordinance would end up being a mixture of both of these and kind of picking the better parts that would translate over to Richland County.
So again, just want to lift up that the clerk's office is going to send out an email to all council, to full council, requesting any questions or input in reference to the short-term rental ordinance, and that those items should be submitted to her by June the 6th. In return, they will go to Mr. Kavanaugh's office and be presented back to this body at the end of June.
Yes, ma'am.
If nothing further, thank you, Mr. Kavanaugh.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Our next item is 5B. I move that county council adopt the land development code. Wait a minute, I think I'm skipping one. Am I skipping one? Did I skip one?
Madam Chair,
Thank you.
5A2, but they're similarly situated, but you did not read it.
Okay, well, I'll read it into the record, and if we need to further discuss, we'll come back to it. So for the 5A2 is direct the county administrator to work with staff to ensure the proposed short-term rental ordinance requires each homeowner who wishes to provide a short-term rental to obtain business license and pay accommodations tax. Any discussion on that or anything that you all need to report to us?
That will be included. That was the understanding.
Okay, thank you. And so we will move on to 5B, and that is I move that the county council adopted to the 2021 Land Development Code text amendments and the zoning map recommended by the Planning Commission by unanimous vote on November the 7th, 2022, to take effect on its effective date of the full 2021 Land Development Code text and associated maps. And that was presented by Mr. Brenham, April 4th, 2023. Those items can be found on pages 46 through 49. We've had lengthy conversation about the Land Development Code. We still have lots of questions, so I'm glad to note that it was brought to my attention that we have the Planning Commission here with us today, so hopefully we can get a little bit more clarity. Mr. Administrator, we recognize you.
Thank you, and I appreciate you recognizing me. So just very briefly, for the folks who are not familiar with this process, now that the council has actually turned this over to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission has done its work, the Planning Commission really now is the voice of the recommendations associated that they have made. And with that being said, Madam Chair, if you'd be so willing to recognize, we actually have the chair of the Planning Commission, Mr. Chris Yonke, who is here, who will be the person that will actually be addressing the Planning Commission's recommendations, as again, the Planning Commission is a body that you all appoint and who answer to you and has now done their work. So it would not be for my staff to stand in the way of the Planning Commission. So I would ask that if you consider recognizing the Planning Commission and the chair who is here to speak on behalf of the body.
Recognize, sir.
All right. I am the chair of the Planning Commission, Christopher Yonke, 1624 Deborah Drive, Columbia, 29209. Again, thank you, Madam Chair, for having us here today. I want to recognize my colleagues here in the back. We've got Vice Chair, Ms. Frierson, Mr. Dennis, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Durant, myself, and Mr. Grady. Thank you guys for coming out today. On this topic, we have 3 items: the Land Development Code text, the map, and the actual amendments that we considered the ledger that we built. Please remember the presentation from April 4th. When I came up here, explained that the Plan Commission, we've completed our task of thoroughly reviewing and receiving public input on the LDC. I touched on the history, and this is in your agenda for today, that this process has really been going on since 2016, up to April 4th when I had my presentation. So we are here today and excited to answer questions regarding our work. It's a great opportunity with all of us here to review our ledger of the motions. Go ahead and answer questions. However you'd like to handle this, Madam Chair.
So I will open it up to my colleagues for any questions that you may have. I really thought that all the council members would have been here, and I tried to twist their arms to stay. But yeah, so they're not here, so you get our questions. Yeah, but before I recognize you, Mr. Pugh, I do want to also note that we, at the last meeting, Ms. Newton did ask us to submit questions and/or concerns to the clerk's office. And this was not just for the committee, but it was for everyone. Was that task done?
We did not receive any feedback.
Didn't receive any feedback. But did we send anything out to council as a formality to let them know that that was a request? Like how we made a request just a moment ago. So with that, was that request made?
Not from the clerk's office. I believe
Okay.
the request was for the administration office, not from us.
Mr. Brown, would you like to address that?
I did not have my team send out any requests to county council members to give us feedback from the committee meeting. So that's what I would say, Madam Chair. So if we fail to do that, I'll take ownership of that failure.
Well, I will just point us back to the minutes, and that's why they're here. And so point us back to the minutes, and we'll leave who is responsible for it right in the minutes. But I think that it is important to note that, as Mr. Yonke has already stated, that this is something that's been going on since 2016, way before I came on council, and we still have work to do. We still have work to do, but at the same time, it is important that we do our due diligence to get all the feedback and all the questions from all council members so that we're not delayed any further from doing the work that needs to be done. And so with that being said, I would like to formally make a request to the clerk's office to once again send out an email to anyone, to the full council, asking for input or questions or concerns so that we can then in return get this back to Mr. Brown or Mr. Jensen and the Planning Commission, whoever it needs to go to, so that we're fair, that we're covering everything that needs to be covered at this point. Mr. Pugh, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Yonke and those members of the Planning Commission that are here for all your hard work and dedication that you guys put into this document. It was brought to my attention, this may be a question for the administration office. It was brought to my attention that the recommendations of the Planning Commission is not verbatim in these documents. Is that something that we can fix before or after it leaves this committee?
I believe the Planning Commission can definitely speak to what their recommendations are to provide clarity, and that's why I want to make sure that we allowed the Planning Commission to do so, which would hopefully clear up and take out, any concerns or translations that the staff had. So the answer to your question, I believe, is yes, and that's where the information would come from the Planning Commission, and that should clear up any concerns.
Okay, just for clarity, what I'm saying is, if this document leaves this committee, will we still have an opportunity to fix that verbiage?
If there's any information that does not reflect the actions of the Planning Commission, the answer to your question is yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Pugh, would you like to hear from Mr. Yonke?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Yonke, you're recognized.
Thank you. I see some hands up on the
I
Zoom
see them.
call.
Yep, I got him.
Would like to recognize Councilman Branham, if possible. He had some insights. I would also eventually.
Hold on, this is not your meeting.
Right.
Maybe I'm sure it's allowed.
You can recognize him, but this is a council committee.
I appreciate you. Thank you for having us.
So come back. So no, with that, to be clear,
Yes.
and I say it in jest, and I hope you take it as such. But to be clear, you would like Mr. Brannon to address Mr. Pugh's concern?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Branham, you're recognized to address Mr. Pugh.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I would like to first thank Mr. Yonke for pulling me into this conversation. Yeah, I think that there might be some minor things that we just need to tighten up. And I've spoken with ACA Jensen, and I think we've made note of some of the minor items, and maybe they haven't carried through to, from one draft to another. One minor example is related to properties that are currently zoned RU. Those properties would be divided up into 3 new categories under the Planning Commission's recommendations. And those new categories, they would fall into one of the 3 based on how big they are by acreage. And some of the materials I think I saw from today, it shows one category is from 0 to 3 acres. The next category is from 3 acres to 35 acres. And then the next one, 35 plus. So, if it lands right on 35, just based on how it's typed up, there would be a question of which category does it fall into. But I think that's a very small tweak that can be made potentially after the fact. And I do like the idea of the DNS committee retaining some level of jurisdiction over the matter, even if some recommendations are made to full council and sent up to full council. There might be some ancillary or additional matters that could remain with the committee for like that further specialized look.
Thank you, Mr. Branham. Mr. Pugh, anything further? And so I would like to follow up on just that item. And this is something that I've said every time we've discussed this. And that is, and maybe this is the educator in me, I have a king-size problem with us passing something forward that we already know has mistakes in it, or that is not clear, or that have small changes or large changes. I do, and if your recommendation is very clear, and you know what those are, why can't we have that document before this body and then send it to full council? And I have said it from day one, and I will continue to say it. I am not voting for anything that needs to be cleaned up. I don't understand. I just don't understand why can't we, and I know 2016 is a long time, and if you've been here the entire time, I'm sure you're like, get her done, right? But there are people in District 7 and all across Richland County that is depending on us to get it right the first time. Yes, sir.
I guess this might be a question for Attorney Wright. Is there a time-sensitive issue with this document? Because I totally agree with Councilwoman Barron that if we have a document before us that doesn't speak to exactly what the recommendation is, and we're voting on it in hopes to change the verbiage later, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Madam Chair.
You recognize, sir.
Mr. Pugh, well, and I guess my point of view is that this motion isn't even ready to go before full council yet. I did help, me and Mr. Branham talked to make sure to have the correct verbiage for this motion before he submitted it. But this motion shouldn't really be before full council until full council has actually voted on the maps. That hasn't happened yet. So, as I've stated a number of times before, this council has already approved the text for the land development code. The maps go with the text. Once the maps are approved, we have a complete code that has been approved. Then we can make the amendments. So this would come after the maps are approved. That hasn't happened in full council yet. So this motion isn't even proper to go before full council yet until the maps are completed.
Okay, so I guess my next question is, if the maps are approved, isn't there going to be a gap in between the maps being approved and then this verbiage being approved? Is this going to, if we vote on the maps, are the maps going live and they'll be able to be used for the land code development?
What council can do is when they approve the maps, they can have, it's like they won't take effect until whatever date, 90 days later, whatever. And then in that period, council can take up this motion for the text amendments and approve the text amendments so that they'll take effect at the exact same time.
So I guess my next question is, how did we get this verbiage to where we are right now in committee if we haven't done our due diligence on the maps?
What happened was Mr. Malinowski made a motion that went to Planning Commission. They dealt with the potential amendments, and through all that time, which there's been a year and a half since the text was approved, the maps hadn't been approved yet. Because initially they were supposed to automatically take effect, but the body decided to stop it. So right now we don't have maps.
So being a part of that body that stopped it, I just want to say this, that when we took office, it was under an impression that this should have been approved before we got here. And it was almost like we were being force-fed this whole land code development. And so the body stopped it because we wanted to get some understanding of where we are when it comes to this whole land code development deal. It's a lot of things with this land code development that's been hanging out there in the balance. Like, we were told that community had input. Well, when I speak to my community, they hands down unequivocally said they have not had any input on what this looks like for the surrounding areas in which they live. And so we've also had this land code development tour that's gone on throughout the county. And it still seems that there's no understanding of exactly where we are and what we have going on. I go back to what I said originally. I agree with Ms. Barron. If we got a document in front of us that has holes in it, I don't see why we will approve to move forward.
And I agree. I think that if you have any concerns with the recommended amendments, that, before it goes to the body, you know, deal with those issues before it actually gets to the full body.
So I'd like to recognize our chair, Ms. Newton, who has arrived here in the building. And ma'am, I pass you the gavel and recognize you all at the same time.
You're doing a good
recognize
job.
you all at the same time.
Thank you. So first, I will note that I did have my hand raised in the car. I only lowered it because I was walking into the building. But before I recognize myself, I saw that Ms. English had her hand raised, and I'd ask you to hold on for 1 second, Ms. English, because Mr. Branham also has his hand raised. So, Mr. Branham, Ms. English has a question, but I didn't know if you wanted to address something that was just recently said, or if I can, okay, Ms. English, in her spirit of politeness as ever, is saying that I can recognize you first. So is there anything that you would like to add now, Mr. Branham?
Number one, Councilwoman English is very polite, so thank you for that. But yeah, and I certainly understand the importance of exactness in the wording as it crosses the finish line. Part of my sense or desire to see some votes be taken on the recommendations is that it would be nice to get that sense of at least where the DNS committee stands on, in general, as to these recommendations, and potentially where the full council stands, so that we have as little back and forth when it comes to the drafting that we expect the consultant firm to do for the draft ordinances. I feel confident that the recommendations of the commission as they were drafted are sufficiently specific to be able to review and then make a recommendation. And that's what my understanding of the committee's role here is to make some recommendation, whether it be a provisional one or a partial one or a limited one. I think that would just help in the drafting of, those ordinances, and it would help the public understand where the council stands or where this committee stands on these things. They have been incredibly invested in the process, those that have followed along. I know some of them are there in the chambers today. And I know that in speaking with many of you, my colleagues and peers, that you all have taken the time to digest these things as well. So that's what I would hope, is that the committee, if it's in a place where it's studied these items enough, that they could make a provisional recommendation, send it up to council with that provisional recommendation, ask them to take a vote, and then begin the red line drafting of the ordinances as we fine tune the language. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Branham. And then Ms. English, I know you want to be recognized, and I'll just ask you one question. Is in my coming here, one of the things I realize is we're having about 5 conversations at once, and one of the things that hasn't been discussed is the recommended timeline that's actually in the briefing packet. Is that what you're about to address? So I'm just going to look your way and let you ask your question, and then I'll recognize myself.
Because that was it. That was my question. With everything that we are doing, I know that we are able, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Wright, that if we approve the maps, then on the same day, if we get the language, we can also correct that after we approve the maps.
Right, the first reading can be at the same meeting.
Okay. I would just like some type of timeline, just so we can get some together, some code. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And now, okay, I can be recognized. Thank you. All right, so let me just recognize myself for a minute. So first, again, just to echo the sentiments that you've heard here, thank you to the Planning Commission who has worked so hard on this. Also, thank you to council, because this has been a lot. Thank you to all the constituents who care and who've been monitoring this process and who are here. I see a number of my constituents, and quite frankly, a person I think could be an honorary constituent because she shows up at all my meetings, and I think all of yours too.
Ms. Key.
Yes, I think she knows who she is. So first, if I could just back up for a second and again acknowledge that this has been an extremely complex and convoluted process, and I've worked with a lot of organizations and haven't quite seen anything like this, and there are numerous reasons for that. But in our briefing document, there's a suggested timeline from staff in terms of how we address this process, which would leave these recommendations in the committee for a little while longer while we flesh things out. And I'm looking at page 49 of my agenda packet. We don't have to follow that. We can send whatever straight to full council. We can make whatever adjustments. But if it would please the body, I think it could potentially be helpful for staff to just address, this is what we were recommending with this May, June, July process, and then we'll circle back to some of the other questions and assumptions. Is that possible, Mr. Brown?
Yes, ma'am, Madam Chair. If you would recognize Assistant County Administrator Eric Jensen will directly address that for you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. You're recognized, Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. ACA Eric Jensen for the record. Pleasure to be with you, Council, our committee, excuse me. And as referenced on the final page of the staff report, there is a proposed timeline. And the important thing to understand is that Attorney Wright has made it very clear that the map must be adopted first to complete the existing ordinance before you can make amendments to that ordinance. And that is what his point has been, I think, since day one. And I understand that very clearly. And so this particular timeline is based on his direction and interpretation. And it suggests that the county's consultant, Clarion, who prepared the original text and who also prepared the comprehensive plan, would start drafting red line corrections, which would then come before this body. And then those would be forwarded to the council. And so essentially, it is suggested that this body forward a zoning map that the council could act on, and that then the council could then do some kind of an action such as a moratorium or something to that effect that would essentially freeze that so that it wouldn't go into effect until such time this body and the full council have had a chance to amend the code as recommended by the Planning Commission or as the council sees fit. Because, again, the Planning Commission is purely an advisory body, and so this committee and the full council can accept all, none, and can make any modifications to anything that the Planning Commission recommended as well. And so, again, the recommendation very simply is for this body to forward a zoning map when it is ready to forward it, that it hold the text in committee until it is ready to forward that text to council, and that it guide the consultant Clarion to make any changes that this body feels is appropriate and wants to recommend to the full council.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. And if I may, and I'm making eye contact with you, Attorney Wright, because this is, no matter how many times I say it or explain it, it never ceases to seem weird and confusing. And so for my benefit and everyone's benefit, again, because county council approved the original text and did not approve the associated maps within a set time frame, now council must approve maps to go along with the code that was passed in 2021 so that we can then make further amendments to the text. that the text cannot be officially amended until maps that are associated with the 2021 code are adopted. Please feel free to confirm,
Okay.
deny, or express better.
Right. The land development code is the text and the map. It's one thing. It was bifurcated, but it's still one thing. The council already, November 2021, approved the text, and it's locked in. It's locked in. It's been locked in for a while now. So the text is what it is. Until you approve the maps, because the maps and the text are actually one entity or one body of law, you can't amend it until you complete that body of law, which you've already done the text part. It's like the text is the hand, the maps are the glove. You have to complete that first before you can amend it. So until that's complete, until you have the complete code, which is the text and the map, you can't amend it. So once you get that completed, you can amend it and make necessary adjustments.
I'm sure you can testify that I've tried every permutation possible to say, is there a way we can change the text now? And I've only been
No.
slapped down. Well, that's been denied, all of my permutations. So then again, because it is very clear that there's not a single member of the public, well, there's always one. So besides that one person, generally speaking, neither council nor the public wants to enact a land development code that we know we're not going to use. However, based on how things were approved, we need to approve maps so that we can make the text we want.
That's correct.
Can you affirm that, and again, you mentioned it, but again, just I'm trying to be excruciatingly clear, that were maps to be approved by council that match the code from 2021, can you confirm that even once that happens, we can immediately freeze it so that it doesn't, I don't know if the words are going into effect, but so that we continue to operate
Right.
under the old
Interim
code?
procedures. Right now, we're operating under interim procedures. The interim procedures is the 2005 code. So once you approve the maps to complete the 2021 land development code, you can have an effective date. So the effective date can be, if you want it immediately, you can have it immediately. If you want it to be 90 days later, you can have it 90 days later. If you want it to be more than that, you decide that as far as when the effective date. So you don't have to have a moratorium or anything. You say that the effective date is whatever date you want the effective date to be. And if you approve the amendments prior to the effective date, then you can have them take effect simultaneously.
So then, and please, thank you for your patience, but just I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So then there are multiple options before us. One option is we could forward the maps right now, should the body desire. We could approve the maps and not make them go into effect, but we could do that to untie our hands and allow us to edit the text.
Right, because until you approve the maps, you can't amend anything.
Yes. Alternately, we can firm up what the revisions to the text that we want. We can firm up, these are the revisions to the text that we want, and we can send this new text simultaneously with the map and start both of those processes at the same time. Is that that body language says no?
Yeah, that you have to finish the maps before you do the amendments. So you,
Okay, got it. So is your recommendation that then sequentially, no matter how long we take to update these text amendments, that we, the most expedient process would be to go ahead and send the maps?
right. If it was up to me, y'all would vote on the maps now and just get it over with, so you can amend whatever you want to amend.
And the maps would require 3 readings and a public hearing?
Correct.
Okay, there are many other questions, because I have questions about the ledger, et cetera, that we could ask, but I want to just pause and acknowledge any members here who have questions, and then also Jason Branham has a comment or question. But Ms. Barron, are you asking to be recognized? Okay. I will recognize Mr. Branham and then Gretchen Barron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do understand 100% what the attorney has laid out for us, the path forward. And I think most of us are aware of the fact that the Planning Commission was not operating under this understanding. And as such, the version of the map that was recommended by the Planning Commission included a carrying over of the M1 district from the 2005 Land Development Code. That M1 district is not in the 2021 version of the Land Development Code. And so, as a question for Mr. Wright, being that, the potential outcome of action in this committee is simply a recommendation and not a final adoption, it feels like we could potentially build some public confidence in the process, and knowing that we have that little issue to address with the M1 zoning district. If potentially the committee wanted to make recommendations as to both the adoption of a version of the map as well as Planning Commission recommendations, because it's not a final adoption, is there anything legally inappropriate about that?
The problem's not with the recommendation. The problem is that once it goes to full council, they have to take action on what the committee recommends. So they can't take action on the recommended amendments if they haven't approved the map yet.
Okay, but there is a period of time where they could take that action, right, to, based on the recommendation of the committee, adopt the map with everyone having an understanding that the committee's recommendation was then to subsequently adopt a certain set of Planning Commission recommendations. I get that the map has to be adopted first and then the text amendments. I'm just saying if a recommendation is already in place from the DNS committee, that might help solidify the direction of things to address that issue.
Right. The only problem, like I said, is that if you send it to full council has to do something.
And it wouldn't be at that same meeting where they adopted the map. It would be at a later date. Is that correct?
No, if it goes to full council, it would go the next meeting. Correct? That's my understanding.
Well, okay, but you're indicating we have to adopt a map first. So out of necessity, wouldn't they then need to defer a vote on the Planning Commission recommendations as to the text amendment?
They would need to, but I can't say that they would. They may.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
If I may, Ms. Councilwoman Barron, may I recognize Administrator Brown?
Just very briefly, I was speaking to the county attorney as a conversation. Sometimes the council gets report outs from committees and not necessarily an action. So maybe if you did it as a report out, maybe that could be a mechanism where you could share information and communicate that this is no council action required at this time related to the Planning Commission recommendations, but here's the report out from the committee that we're in support of, whatever the case may be, to try to address what Councilmember Branham is saying, to provide, I guess, a direction for council to be aware that the committee ultimately supports that. So maybe that will help with the map vote. I think that's what he's trying to get to, and I think a report out could get the same thing done without requiring the council to take any action, just as a way of communicating that information. That's what I want to add.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. And at this point, I think that report out might be a conversation of the body and not necessarily a consensus of the body based on the sense that I'm getting from the committee. I do want to acknowledge that it's 5:55 and we do have a committee in a few minutes. So let me recognize Councilwoman Barron. Okay. All right. So again, sometimes all the choices that you have are hard ones. And I think that that's where we are here. So let me just state for the record that am on board in terms of following the legal process in terms of how we move forward. It's clear that there are recommendations that have been made by the Planning Commission and that many members of the body want to adopt those changes, and that the code that was passed in 2021 is not one that we want to be operating under without revisions. That said, what opens the most doors to us in terms of editing the text is moving to adopt the map. And so my question would be, as you consider the difference with the M1 designation, if there was a motion to be approved that we adopt the map and immediately apply a moratorium, insert language here, is there any other adjustment to the motion that would need to be made to accommodate the difference with M1?
No, and I wouldn't use the word moratorium. I would just say that the effective date would be a different date. But no, it would be a 6-fingered glove on a 5-fingered hand, but sometimes you may have to do that.
All right. Is there a motion to adopt the map and to forward that to council for recommendation with an effective date of, make it, who knows, December 31st, to give us time to fix the land development code? Is there a desire to send that on to council with whatever date you desire? Hearing none, thank you. This item will remain in committee. Thank you to the Planning Commission. I'm sorry that we'll have to invite you back out again. There was a direct request to the clerk that she send out a request to council for feedback. I would also request that the ledger be attached so that when we're talking specifically about the ledger, and if there's any way that we can make the language correct this next time, that would be fantastic. That would bring us to, I'm not looking at my agenda, the next item I believe is adjournment.
Oh.
It is not? Hold on. That's when you miss dealing with paper. I got it. All right, so there are 2 items pending analysis that have no action required that can remain in committee as there's no action required on those 2 items. So that would take care of 6A and 6B, which would then bring us to happy item number 7. Oh, yep, Mr. Pugh.
I'd like to recognize my good friend John Metz, who is also a part of the Planning Commission. They left him out when they were talking about who I was here from the Planning Commission.
I would never want to not recognize your good friend, John Metz, and I bet that he would feel particularly appreciated if we addressed item number 7.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, will you call for the roll?
Pugh,
Yes.
Barron,
Yes.
English,
Yes.
Newton.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Meeting adjourned.